Welcome to this explainer, everyone. Today we're unpacking what is honestly one of the most stunning, jaw-dropping group stage contrasts we've ever witnessed in modern international football. Literally, on one side of the pitch, we've got the complete, systemic collapse of a two-time World Cup winning giant, Uruguay. And on the exact opposite side, we're looking at the historic, deeply romantic rise of absolute debutants, Cape Verde. I mean, how on earth does a team with all the pedigree in the world crash out while a nation of just 500,000 people advances? Well, let's break it all down. Okay, let's dive into this roadmap. We're going to cover the fall of a football giant, Bielsa's stubborn tactical failures, and the chemistry chaos behind the scenes. Then, we'll flip the script to Cape Verde's historic rise, the anatomy of their defense, and how grit ultimately defeats pedigree.
Part 1, the fall of a football giant.
So Uruguay is officially heading home early, following a super frustrating 1-0 defeat to a very slow, really pedestrian Spain side. Putting my coach's hat on for a second here, their setup was just completely devoid of offensive flow. It was perfectly summarized by critics who flat out noted Uruguay were a disgrace, and all they had was to kick lumps out of Spain. Because forwards like Darwin Núñez just couldn't generate opportunities, they basically resorted to an aggressively disruptive game plan instead of actually outplaying their opponents. It was tough to watch.
Which brings us to Part 2, Bielsa's stubborn tactical failures.
This total failure leads directly back to manager Marcelo Bielsa's self-destructive reliance on athletic pressing at the extreme expense of technical quality on the ball. His squad rotation, or lack thereof, was a stunning indictment of this stubbornness. You know, he left highly technical players like Lucas Torreira and Rodrigo Zalazar, a guy who had over 20 goal contributions in his league, by the way, just sitting at home. Instead, he brings a severely unfit Darwin Núñez and, bafflingly, brings goalkeeper Fernando Muslera out of retirement. It completely ruined their offensive flow.
And that bizarre decision brings us to a really massive number, 3. By choosing a retired Muslera over a perfectly fit Sergio Rochet, Bielsa completely doomed his own defense. We saw individual failures in Uruguay's defensive transitions just mount up, with Muslera committing 3 devastating errors across the group stage. The absolute final nail in the coffin, fumbling Alex Baina's weak, totally powerless shot directly into the net against Spain. You just can't make this stuff up. Moving right along to Part 3, chemistry, chaos, and disconnect.
But look, the failures weren't just on the coach's chalkboard. As we know, poor team chemistry will ruin even the best tactics. The reports coming out of the Uruguayan camp were absolutely disastrous. We're talking about a combative manager publicly clashing with players, deep factions forming, and notoriously strict training methods that completely alienated the squad. Core experienced leaders simply ghosted through all 3 matches because the environment behind the scenes was entirely broken. Now, what's really interesting about this next point is that nothing captures this systemic collapse better than one singular, highly visible moment. When team captain Federico Valverde was substituted off early against Spain, he coldly ignored Marcelo Bielsa, just totally blanked him. When your captain visually demonstrates that level of disconnect on the world's biggest stage, your tactical execution on the field is already dead in the water.
So, with Uruguay completely self-destructing, we're left with a fascinating question. How does a nation of just 500,000 people defensively outclass a historic football giant and swoop in to take their spot? Let's pivot our narrative away from Uruguay's toxicity for a minute and look at the absolute romance of this tournament.
Here is Part 4, Cape Verde's historic rise. Enter Cape Verde, a rising underdog defying literally every historical expectation. The contrast here is staggering, guys. On one side, Uruguay, a 2-time World Cup winner struggling to maintain its relevance in modern tournaments. On the other, Cape Verde, a tiny island nation of 500,000 people, where until very recently, players were literally developing their skills on dirt pitches. This is the ultimate David versus Goliath structural flip. And this brilliantly illustrates that this miracle didn't just happen overnight. It was a huge triumph of resource development. Back in 2002, they barely had proper grass fields. But by utilizing FIFA grants in the mid-2000s, building up local academies, and brilliantly scouting players of Cape Verdean descent from the diaspora, they built this sustainable infrastructure that culminated in this historic 2026 debut.
All right, Part 5, the anatomy of a defense.
Going back to the coach's chalkboard for a second, how did they actually execute this on the pitch?
Well, once again, we look at the number 3. But this time around, it represents 3 completely unbeaten draws in the group stages, crowned by a highly disciplined 0-0 draw against Asian giant Saudi Arabia to officially secure their advancement. Just an incredible effort. So here is their brilliant defensive blueprint. Step 1. Resilient, star-making goalkeeping performances from Bosnia, which stands in total contrast to Uruguay's individual errors, right? Step 2. A highly organized low-block defensive wall anchored by Pico Lopez and Dini Borges that made them incredibly difficult to break down. And step 3. A completely fearless, pressure-free mindset.
Honestly, their mindset was absolutely everything here. As observers noted, they haven't come to this World Cup and been fearful, they had a go. While traditional teams played with this heavy anxiety, Cape Verde played with pure joy, totally backed by fans dancing in the stands. They accepted they might get beat, but they were determined to die on their shield trying. It is literally the absolute opposite of Uruguay's miserable, disjointed failure.
Which leads us into part 6, Grit defeats historic pedigree. So the crucial point is, bringing both these narratives together, why did the giant fall to the wayside while the underdog marched forward? Well, Uruguay suffered from tactical bankruptcy, toxic chemistry, and a stubborn management that just flat out refused to adapt. Conversely, Cape Verde advanced because they leaned into absolute unity, flawless defensive grit, and a strategic discipline that maximized their resources. Strategy and heart completely dismantled historical expectations. Which leaves us with a final, provocative question for you all to think about. In modern football, with infrastructure and scouting leveling the playing field, does unified underdog grit now outright outweigh fractured historical pedigree? Uruguay's decline and Cape Verde's beautiful rise certainly suggest the landscape of international football is shifting right beneath our feet. Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer. I really hope it gave you a whole new perspective on the beautiful game.